I realized they had used my pension for a party the moment I saw the receipt for champagne I have never liked. It was too early in the morning for anger, too quiet for excuses. The kitchen clock ticked, the kettle cooled, and on the bank statement in front of me sat a charge that did not belong to my life. At 72, you learn the difference between help and theft. That morning, I finally named it. I have lived carefully for most of my years. Not fearfully, carefully. I worked 38 years as a municipal accountant, the kind no one remembers but everyone depends on. I balanced other people's mistakes, corrected their optimism, closed their loose ends. I trusted numbers more than promises, because numbers, at least, stay where you put them. When I retired, my pension became modest but predictable. Enough for rent, medication, groceries, and the quiet dignity of not asking anyone for anything. My daughter, Elaine, insisted I let her help manage things. It sounded reasonable. She had a family, children, a husband who was always between jobs, but never between plans. I signed a few forms. Automatic transfers, she called them. Just small amounts, support, temporary. Family takes care of family. That word, temporary, lasted 6 years. At first, it was groceries, then school fees, then emergencies that came regularly, like rent. I noticed the amounts grew, but every time I asked, Elaine sighed the same way she used to as a teenager, like I was embarrassing her by existing. Mom, it's just easier this way. Easier for whom was never discussed. That morning, the charge was for a private event space. There was also catering, decorations, music. I stared at the screen longer than I should have, waiting for confusion to rescue me. It didn't. I opened social media, something I rarely do, and there it was. Smiling faces, glasses raised, balloons spelling a word I didn't recognize as part of my life. Anniversary, perhaps, or promotion. Something joyful. Something funded by the woman they forgot to invite. I didn't cry. Crying would have meant surprise. What I felt instead was clarity, sharp and calm. They hadn't taken my money by accident. They had taken it because I had been quiet long enough for them to believe silence meant permission. I sat at the small table by the window and pulled out my folder. I keep things in folders. Old habit. Statements, authorizations, signatures that looked like mine because they were. My name had been doing their work for years while my body stayed in this apartment, careful not to cost too much. I thought of the last time Elaine visited. She checked her phone more than my face, told me I should consider cheaper medication, asked if I really needed the heating on so high. Then she hugged me quickly and said, "Thanks, Mom. You're a lifesaver." She meant the account, not the woman. By noon, I had made a decision that did not feel brave. It felt overdue. I put on my coat, the sensible one, and walked to the bank branch 3 streets away. The clerk recognized me. They always do when you come often and ask for little. I asked for a full list of outgoing transfers and sat quietly while the printer hummed like an honest thing. If you enjoy the stories here, dear, you're welcome to join our Patreon. There you'll find exclusive tales that never appear on YouTube, and new stories come out earlier than anywhere else. The link is just below. We're waiting for you. When the papers were placed in front of me, I did not rush. I read every line: parties, subscriptions, services I had never used, locations I had never been. This was not survival. This was lifestyle. "I'd like to freeze all transfers immediately," I said. My voice did not shake. "And I want to speak with a financial inspector. Today." The clerk looked at me differently then. not with pity, not with impatience, but with respect, as if she understood that something irreversible had just begun. I walked home slowly. My pension would arrive next week, untouched for the first time in years. I made myself soup and ate it standing up, the way I did when my husband was alive and time mattered. Outside, the afternoon went on without me, as it always had. They would call, they would explain, they would accuse. I knew that already, but for the first time in a long while, the numbers were back where they belonged. And so was I. I did not always know how to say no. That is something people assume about women my age. That we were born stern, already tired, already guarded. It isn't true. I learned discipline early, but boundaries came much later and at a higher price. I grew up in a house where money was never discussed aloud. It simply existed or didn't. My father worked at the rail depot. My mother cleaned offices in the evenings. They never complained, never explained. When there was less, we ate simpler food. When there was more, my mother bought new curtains. That was the whole philosophy. You adjusted quietly and carried on. Numbers became my refuge. In school, arithmetic made sense in a way people never quite did. 2 plus 2 did not change its mind depending on mood. It did not flatter you, did not guilt you, did not promise anything it couldn't deliver. When I became an accountant, I felt at home among ledgers and columns. I spent my life telling departments what they could afford, not what they wanted to hear. I was respected for it, even when they disliked me. At home, I was different. Softer. My husband used to joke that I balanced the city's budget with iron hands and then came home and let life spill all over the kitchen table. He wasn't wrong. When he died, suddenly, unfairly, I learned how thin the line was between control and chaos. I tightened everything I could. Bills paid on time, no debt, no indulgences, survival disguised as order. Elaine was already grown then, with opinions sharper than her patience. She loved me, I don't doubt that. But love does not always include consideration. When she married Martin, I saw how quickly responsibility slid off him and landed elsewhere, mostly on her. Eventually, on me. It started the year I retired. I remember the meeting at the pension office, the polite smiles, the folder they handed me like a certificate of survival. Elaine came with me. She asked questions I didn't think to ask. She sounded confident, modern. When she suggested consolidating accounts to avoid stress, I agreed. Stress had already taken enough from me. The first transfer felt harmless, a safety net. The second felt necessary. By the third, it felt expected. Each time I hesitated, there was a story. Prices rising. Children needing more. Martin's work slowing down. I listened the way mothers do. Not for truth, but for need. Somewhere along the way, my pension stopped being mine in their eyes. It became a shared resource, like air or water. When I mentioned tightening things, Elaine would laugh lightly and say, "Mom, you don't even spend money," as if restraint made me less entitled to my own earnings. I did spend it, just not on noise. I spent it on peace, on knowing exactly how much I had left, on not being a burden. Ironically, that fear made me one. After the bank that day, I sat at my desk and opened an old notebook. The one where I used to jot reminders when I still worked. In the back pages, I found notes I'd written years ago, dates, amounts, reasons. I had been tracking it without admitting why. That realization stung more than the champagne charge. I had known, just not consciously enough to stop it. By evening, my phone was still silent. They hadn't noticed yet. Or maybe they had and were rehearsing. I made tea and sat in the chair by the window, watching the lights come on across the street. Ordinary lives continuing without drama. I wasn't angry, not yet. Anger requires energy, and I was conserving mine. What I felt was resolve, quiet and immovable. The same feeling I used to have when closing a fiscal year with discrepancies no one wanted to explain. You don't shout in those moments. You document. You verify. And then you act. That night, I slept better than I had in months. Elaine called the next morning, just after 9. She always called after 9, never earlier, never later, as if motherhood had office hours. "Mom, did you change something with the bank?" Her voice was light, almost amused, the way people sound when they expect a small correction, not a wall. "Yes," I said. I was sitting at the table, hands wrapped around a mug I'd already finished. I froze the transfers. There was a pause. Not silence. Calculation. I knew that sound well. It was the same one department heads made when they realized I wouldn't adjust the numbers to make them look competent. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "We talked about this." "No," I replied. "You talked. I listened." She sighed, loudly, deliberately. "Mom, you're overreacting. It was just a party, a family thing." "A party I didn't attend," I said. "Paid for with money I didn't approve." "You don't need approval for everything," she snapped, then caught herself. "I mean, we're family. It all evens out." That word again. Family. A word used when clarity becomes inconvenient. Martin's voice drifted in the background. I couldn't hear the words, but I knew the tone. Annoyed, distant, already resentful of a problem that interrupted his morning. Elaine covered the receiver briefly, then came back sharper. "Do you have any idea how this affects us?" she said. "Things are scheduled. Bills. Commitments." "I'm aware," I answered. "I've been funding them." "You're retired, Mom. That money isn't going anywhere." I laughed then. Just once. It surprised both of us. "That money is going exactly where it's meant to," I said. "To keep me alive, warm, independent." Her voice hardened. "So, this is punishment?" "No," I said. "This is correction." She went quiet again. When she spoke, it was slower, lower. "You're being difficult." That hurt more than I expected. Not because it was cruel, but because it was familiar. I had been difficult my whole life. Difficult when I asked questions. Difficult when I refused to be rushed. Difficult when I didn't pretend not to notice. "I'm being accurate," I said. "There's a difference." The call ended shortly after. No goodbye. Just the dull click of someone who had decided I was no longer cooperative. The next call came an hour later. Martin, this time. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "This isn't fair," he said. "You can't just pull support without notice." "I can," I replied. And I did. "You're destabilizing our household." I looked around my kitchen. The clean counters. The paid bills stacked neatly in a drawer. My quiet. "You've been stabilizing yours with my pension," I said. "Without asking." He scoffed. "You're not exactly struggling." That was the moment. Not the parties. Not the lies. That sentence. "I struggle," I said calmly, "to be seen as a person instead of a resource." He hung up. By the afternoon, messages started arriving. Long ones, accusatory ones. Some tried guilt, the children, their future, stress. Others tried nostalgia. All we've done together, all we've been through. One even suggested I was being influenced by someone else, as if a woman my age couldn't arrive at a conclusion on her own. I didn't answer. not out of cruelty, out of necessity. When people are used to taking, any pause feels like aggression. Instead, I gathered paperwork, pension statements, authorization forms, bank correspondence. I laid them out the way I used to prepare audits, chronologically, unemotionally. Facts do not need tone. In the late afternoon, I called the number the clerk had given me, the financial inspector's office. I introduced myself without apology. I believe my pension has been misused under informal authority, I said. I'd like an independent review. The woman on the line asked questions. Clear ones. She didn't rush me. She didn't soften her voice. She treated me like someone whose time mattered. When I hung up, my hands trembled slightly. Not fear, release. By evening, my phone was silent again. No apologies, no understanding, just distance. I made myself dinner and ate slowly. I wasn't alone in the way people fear. I was alone in the way that finally allows you to hear your own thoughts without interruption. And for the first time in years, those thoughts were mine. The first lie surfaced 3 days later, small and poorly constructed, like most lies told in a hurry. Elaine showed up without calling. That alone told me she had rehearsed the visit in her head and decided surprise would work better than permission. She stood in the doorway with a paper bag from a bakery I don't like, holding it the way people hold peace offerings they don't intend to give sincerely. You look tired, she said, stepping inside before I could answer. I slept well, I replied. I closed the door and went back to the kitchen table. If she wanted to talk, she would have to sit. I wasn't circling this conversation. She placed the bag between us and sighed. Mom, this whole thing has gotten out of hand. It started out of hand, I said. It just stayed there for years. She ignored that. About the charges you saw, the party, it wasn't what you think. I waited. Silence is a good tool. It makes people fill it with truth or expose the lack of it. It was partly reimbursed, she continued quickly. Martin's friend was supposed to cover most of it. The transfer from your account was temporary. We were going to put it back. When? I asked. Soon, she said. Then corrected herself. Eventually. I opened the folder I had prepared and slid one page toward her. Dates, amounts, recurring expenses tied to entertainment companies, event planners, subscription services. Which of these were temporary? I asked. She barely glanced at the paper. You're micromanaging. I'm auditing, I said. There's a difference. Her jaw tightened. You always do this. Turn everything into numbers. No, I said quietly. I turn lies into numbers because numbers don't lie back. She leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. You're acting like we stole from you. You used my pension without consent, I replied. That is not acting. That is definition. She laughed then, not kindly. You sound dramatic. That was the second lie, that I was emotional, unstable, unreasonable. It's a convenient label when facts don't cooperate. I've already spoken to a financial inspector, I said. I watched her face carefully when I said it. People tell you everything in half a second if you let them. Her color drained. You did what? I requested a review, I said. Independent. You can't do that, she said too fast. That's extreme. So was redirecting my pension for parties, I answered. She stood abruptly. Do you have any idea what this could do to us? To Martin's work? To the kids? I have an exact idea, I said. I've been funding it. She paced the small kitchen like a trapped animal. This is just a misunderstanding. We can fix it. I'll explain it to them. You already explained, I said. Just not to me. That was when the truth slipped, as it always does when people are tired of pretending. You don't need all that money, she said. You're alone. You don't go anywhere. There it was, clean, unvarnished. I looked at my daughter, the woman I raised to speak carefully, to think before she took, and felt something settle permanently inside me. My life, I said slowly, does not need witnesses to be valid. She opened her mouth, then closed it. There was nothing left that wouldn't expose her further. When she left, she took the bakery bag with her. I noticed that only because it felt symbolic. Even the offering had been borrowed. That evening, the inspector called back, asked for documents, authorization scopes, timelines. Her voice was professional, neutral. She did not ask how I felt. She asked what happened. I answered clearly, calmly, truthfully. After the call, I stood by the sink and watched the sky darken. I wasn't shaken. I wasn't triumphant. I was done being lied to politely. And that, I knew, was the part they would never forgive. I found out about the second party by accident, which is how truth usually arrives when it's been carefully hidden. It was the pharmacist who mentioned it. We had known each other for years, not personally, but in the way people know each other when one watches the other age in predictable increments. While he rang up my prescription, he smiled and said, I hope you enjoyed the celebration last weekend. Looked quite lively. I didn't respond right away. At my age, pauses are forgiven. People assume slowness, not calculation. What celebration? I asked. He glanced at the screen, then back at me. Your family's. The one at the Lakeside Pavilion. I filled in for my cousin with the catering crew. Your daughter was there. Big group. Very festive. Festive. Such a harmless word for something funded quietly, deliberately, with money siphoned from a woman who eats soup twice a week to keep her budget neat. I thanked him, took my bag, and walked home slowly. My legs felt steady, but something inside me had shifted again, clicking into place like a lock finishing its turn. One party could be explained away as poor judgment. Two meant routine. At home, I opened my laptop and did something I hadn't done before. I searched public event bookings. Community venues keep records. Transparency is their quiet virtue. It took me 10 minutes to find the reservation. Elaine's name wasn't on it. Martin's was. I pulled my bank statements beside the screen. Same date, same amount, same smooth transfer executed without hesitation, without permission. They hadn't just used my pension. They had planned around it. That evening, Elaine sent a message. No greeting, no question. We need to talk. This has gone too far. I read it twice, then set the phone down. I did not reply. Words are wasted when someone believes the conversation exists only to bring you back into line. Instead, I called the inspector's office again. This time, I didn't sound like a woman seeking clarification. I sounded like someone filing a report. I've discovered additional unauthorized use, I said. Recurring, non-essential. I have documentation. The man on the line thanked me for my thoroughness. He asked how far back it went. I told him the truth. 6 years, I said. Possibly more. There was a pause, not of doubt, but of gravity. We'll need full access to your statements and the original authorization language, he said, and we'll likely contact the recipients. That's fine, I replied. They're used to being contacted on my behalf. When I hung up, my hands were calm. No shaking, no racing heart. This was familiar territory. I had spent my career unraveling systems people swore were harmless because everyone benefited. Everyone except the one footing the bill. The phone rang later that night. Martin, again. "You're embarrassing us," he said. No hello, no restraint. "I'm documenting," I answered. "You're making it sound criminal." "I'm not making it sound like anything," I said. "I'm describing it." He exhaled sharply. "You could have just asked." "I did," I replied. "For years. You answered with silence and invoices." He hung up without another word. I stood by the window afterward, watching the streetlights flicker on. Somewhere, music was probably playing again. Glasses clinking. Laughter paid for by a woman they thought too old to notice patterns. They were wrong. That night, I labeled a new folder and placed it on my desk. I didn't name it after them. I named it after myself. For the first time in a long while, my pension was not funding celebrations I would never attend. It was funding clarity. And clarity, once paid for, is impossible to return. They tried a softer approach after that. When force didn't work, they reached for concern. Elaine came again, this time with her voice lowered and her eyes carefully worried. She sat across from me like she used to when she wanted permission as a child, hands folded, shoulders slightly forward. It was almost convincing. "Mom, we're scared," she said. "This inspector thing, you don't understand how serious it can get." "I understand seriousness," I replied. "I lived with it." She shook her head. "No, this is different. People could misinterpret things. You know how paperwork is. One wrong phrase and suddenly it looks like fraud." "It looks like misuse," I said. "Because it was." She leaned in. "You're 72. Do you really want to deal with investigations, interviews, stress? This can affect your health." There it was. The concern that only appears when control slips. I watched her carefully. Her eyes flicked to the folder on my table, then away. "My health," I said, "has survived worse than honesty." She sighed, this time softer. "You're not being reasonable." "I'm being precise," I answered. That was when she tried to reframe it, the way people do when truth refuses to cooperate. "We didn't take anything," she said. "You gave permission. You signed the forms." "I signed for assistance," I said. "Not entertainment, not events, not repeated withdrawals for non-essential expenses." "That's subjective," she snapped, then caught herself again. "I mean, what's essential to you isn't always what's essential to us." I nodded slowly. "Exactly, which is why it shouldn't come from my pension." She stood up, paced once, then stopped in front of me. "You're acting like we abused you." "You abused access," I replied. "That's quieter. People think it hurts less." Her face hardened. "So what? Now you're a victim." "No," I said. "I'm a woman correcting a mistake." She crossed her arms. "Everyone will think we took advantage of you." "They'll think whatever the records show," I said calmly. That was the moment the politeness cracked completely. "You've always been like this," she said. "Cold, calculating. You care more about rules than people." I looked at her then, really looked. "Rules," I said, "are what protect people when kindness is taken as weakness." She didn't answer. She grabbed her coat and walked out without another word. Later that day, the inspector called again. He asked if anyone had tried to influence me since the review began. I told him the truth. "Yes," I said. "They've tried to convince me I'm confused." He paused. "That's important," he said. "Please document any further contact." I wrote it down carefully after the call. Date, time, summary. Just like I used to at work. Familiar motions, steady hands. By evening, my phone was quiet again. Not a single apology. Not a single question about how I was holding up. I made myself dinner and ate slowly, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. I wasn't lonely. I was observant. They had tried fear. They had tried guilt. Now they had tried concern. None of it worked because none of it was true. What was true was this. They were losing access, and they knew it. And the louder they spoke, the clearer it became that this had never been about family. It had been about entitlement. And entitlement, once challenged, rarely forgives the person who finally stands still and says no. That night, sleep refused to come. Not because of fear and not because of regret. It was the kind of wakefulness that settles in when your mind finally stops lying to itself. I lay in bed, listening to the building breathe. Pipes knocking softly. A neighbor's television murmuring through the wall. Ordinary sounds that had always meant safety to me. This time, they felt like witnesses. I replayed the years carefully, not with bitterness, but with the same attention I once gave spreadsheets. I remembered when the transfers stopped being requests and became assumptions. When Elaine stopped asking if and started saying when. When Martin began speaking about my pension as if it were a shared account, a background utility like electricity. I had told myself it was temporary. I had told myself families adjust. I had told myself that being needed, even financially, was better than being forgotten. That was the lie I had told myself. Around 2 in the morning, I got up and sat at the small desk by the window. I turned on the lamp and opened a notebook I hadn't touched in years. Not the financial one, a plain one, lined pages. The kind people use when they still believe words can hold things, numbers can't. I wrote a single sentence. When did help turn into obligation? I didn't answer it right away. Instead, memories surfaced. Elaine at 12, furious because I wouldn't buy her expensive shoes. Elaine at 25, crying because she felt trapped by responsibility. Elaine at 40, irritated because I asked what the transfers were for. The pattern was clear when I stopped excusing it. I had taught her that I would absorb discomfort so she wouldn't have to. I had trained her to expect it. That realization hurt more than any accusation they had thrown at me, because it meant this wasn't just something done to me. It was something I had allowed, slowly, quietly, with the best intentions and the worst outcome. By 4, the sky outside had begun to pale. That soft, uncertain light that doesn't belong to night or morning. I made tea and stood by the window, watching the city wake up without ceremony. Delivery trucks, early buses, people with purpose. I thought of my career. All those years of insisting on clarity, of correcting others while letting my own life run on emotional overdraft. I had protected institutions better than I had protected myself. At 6, my phone buzzed. A message from Elaine. Short. We can fix this if you stop now. I read it once. Then again. There was no how are you, no are you okay. Just a request disguised as an offer. Compliance presented as reconciliation. I didn't respond. Instead, I wrote another line in the notebook. Stopping now would mean agreeing that this was acceptable. And it wasn't. By morning, the exhaustion was there, but it was clean. Honest. I showered, dressed, and ate a proper breakfast for the first time in days. Not because I felt calm, but because I felt decided. Later that morning, I received an email from the inspector's office. Formal, courteous. They outlined next steps, potential timelines, what documentation would be required, and what my role would be. No drama, no judgment. I printed it, and placed it in the folder. When I looked at myself in the mirror before leaving the apartment, I saw an old woman. Yes, lined, gray, unremarkable by modern standards. But I also saw someone I recognized again. Someone who understood cause and effect. Someone who knew that silence is not peace when it's bought with self-erasure. I locked the door behind me and felt the weight of the keys in my hand. For years, I had mistaken endurance for virtue. That night without sleep had stripped that belief away, and once stripped, it did not grow back. By the 8th day, I stopped feeling like I was reacting. I was preparing. There is a difference, and it matters. Reaction is noisy inside the body. Preparation is quiet. It asks for order. I cleared the dining table and turned it into what it used to be for me, a working surface. I laid everything out with space between documents, the way I was taught long ago. Bank statements in chronological order, pension agreements, authorization forms, emails, notes from phone calls, dated and timed. Nothing dramatic, nothing interpretive, just facts allowed to stand on their own feet. It took hours. My back ached, my knees complained when I stood, but I didn't rush. Rushing creates mistakes, and mistakes are gifts to people who want to discredit you. As I worked, patterns became undeniable. Transfers that increased right after my rent went up. Extra withdrawals in months when I skipped dentist appointments. Charges clustered around holidays, long weekends, school breaks. My restraint had funded their comfort with impressive regularity. What struck me most was how consistent it all was. Not chaotic, not desperate, structured, planned. This was not need. This was budgeting, just not mine. I remembered how often Elaine had told me not to worry, how often she'd said, "We've got it under control." She was right about one thing. They did. They had controlled it by assuming I would never look too closely. At midday, I received a formal letter by email. The inspector assigned to my case introduced himself properly this time. Full name, department, case reference number. He outlined potential classifications: misuse of funds under informal authority, failure to disclose material use, dependency exploitation. The language was careful, neutral. It did not accuse. It described. I read it twice, then once more aloud. Words sound different when you let them. Dependency exploitation. I did not like the term, but I did not reject it either. Discomfort does not make something false. In the afternoon, I did something that surprised even me. I called my pension fund directly, not to complain, to clarify. The representative was polite, efficient, young. He explained what permissions I had granted years ago and what limits they technically carried. When I asked whether my pension was intended to fund third-party lifestyle expenses indefinitely, there was a pause. "No, ma'am," he said. "That would not be considered appropriate use." "Thank you," I replied. That was all I needed. That evening, Elaine called again. I let it ring. Then again. Then Martin. Then a message. "You're blowing this out of proportion. People will think we're criminals." I looked at the message for a long moment before deleting it. People don't think. Records do. I placed the last document into the folder and closed it. The sound was soft but final. I labeled it with the date and my name. Nothing else. Later, sitting in my chair with my feet elevated, I noticed something unexpected. I wasn't anxious about the outcome. I wasn't imagining apologies or consequences. I wasn't rehearsing conversations. What I felt was distance. Clean distance. For the first time in years, my survival no longer depended on being agreeable. My worth was no longer measured by how smoothly I made other people's lives run. I went to bed early that night, not exhausted, settled. Whatever came next would come through official channels with proper language and clear boundaries. I would answer questions. I would provide documents. I would not justify my existence or apologize for protecting it. I had spent decades making sure systems worked as intended. Now, finally, I was including myself in that responsibility. The meeting with the inspector took place on a Tuesday, which felt appropriate. Tuesdays have no illusions. They don't pretend to be beginnings or endings. They exist to get things done. I arrived early, as I always have. The building was plain, municipal, the kind I knew well from my working years. Neutral walls, quiet corridors, no unnecessary decoration. It calmed me immediately. This was a place that respected procedure over performance. The inspector was a man in his early 40s, neatly dressed, with the tired eyes of someone who had learned not to be surprised by human behavior. He stood when I entered, shook my hand, and addressed me by my full name. That alone mattered. "Thank you for coming prepared," he said, gesturing toward the folder in my hands. "I always do," I replied. We sat across from each other at a simple table. No glass walls, no observers. Just two people and the weight of documentation. He didn't rush me. He let me place the papers where I wanted them, in the order I chose. That told me something else. He understood control, and he was giving it back to me. He asked me to explain, in my own words, how the arrangement began. I spoke slowly, without decoration, dates, intentions, scope. I did not describe feelings unless they explained a decision. I did not accuse. I stated. He listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, occasionally asking for clarification. When I finished, he leaned back slightly and exhaled. "This is extensive," he said carefully, "and very clear." "That was the goal," I replied. He pointed to a section of the statements. "Did you ever explicitly approve expenses of this nature?" "No," I said. And when I questioned them, I was reassured, not informed. He nodded. That distinction matters. We moved through the paperwork together. He highlighted repeated patterns, increases over time, expenditures that fell outside any reasonable definition of support. At one point, he paused and looked at me directly. "Has anyone pressured you to withdraw this complaint?" "Yes," I answered. "They framed it as concern for my health." He wrote something down and did not comment further. Near the end of the meeting, he explained the process ahead. Formal notices, requests for explanation, possible referrals if inconsistencies remained unresolved. He did not promise outcomes. He promised procedure. "That's all I'm asking for," I said. When I stood to leave, he said something unexpected. "You were right to come in yourself." "I know," I replied, and I did. Outside, the air felt sharper, cleaner. I walked a few blocks before sitting on a bench to rest. My hands were steady. My chest was quiet. There was no triumph in me, no anticipation of fallout. Only alignment. My phone buzzed while I was sitting there. A message from Elaine. "We've been contacted. This didn't have to happen." I looked at the screen, then locked the phone without replying. It did have to happen. It happened the moment silence became permission, and permission became expectation. It happened the moment my life was reduced to a line item. I stood, adjusted my coat, and began the walk home. For years, I had been told I was too rigid, too careful, too attached to rules. But rules, when used correctly, do something simple and necessary. They return power to the person who was quietly losing it. The transfers officially froze on a Thursday afternoon. I know the exact time because I wrote it down. 3:17 p.m. Not out of anxiety, but out of habit. Moments that change the shape of your life deserve to be marked accurately. The bank notified me first. A short, factual message confirming that all outgoing automatic payments under third-party authority were suspended pending review. No emotion, no commentary, just confirmation. I read it twice, then folded the paper and placed it in the folder with everything else. That was the moment the silence broke. Elaine called within 20 minutes. I watched the phone ring until it stopped. Then again. Then Martin. Then a message from a number I didn't recognize. One of their friends, I assumed, reaching on their behalf. I deleted it without opening. By evening, the tone shifted. The messages became urgent, then angry, then pleading. Statements I recognized immediately, not because they were true, but because I had heard them all before in different forms. We're panicking. You've put us in an impossible position. You don't understand the damage you're causing. I understood it perfectly. I had simply stopped absorbing it. I made myself dinner, something simple, nothing celebratory. I wasn't marking a victory. I was adjusting to a new reality. When you've lived for years as a financial buffer, people feel the cold immediately when you step away. That night, Martin finally showed up in person. He didn't knock politely. He knocked like a man who believed urgency gave him permission. I opened the door but didn't step aside. "This is insane," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Cards are declining. Payments are bouncing. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is?" I looked at him carefully. "You should speak to your bank," I said, the same way I had to. He scoffed. "You can't just cut us off without warning." "I didn't cut you off," I replied. "I removed unauthorized access." He stared at me as if I'd spoken another language. "You're enjoying this," he accused. "No," I said. "I'm surviving it." Elaine appeared behind him, eyes red, jaw tight. "Mom, please," she said. "This has gone far enough." "It stopped where it should have stopped years ago," I answered. She stepped forward. "We need time. Just give us time." "I gave you 6 years," I said. "You used it." They stood there, waiting for the door to open wider, for the conversation to soften, for me to do what I had always done, compromise myself to restore comfort. I didn't. "This conversation is over," I said quietly. "Any further communication should go through the inspector." Martin laughed sharply. "You really want to turn this into a legal mess?" "You already did," I replied. "I'm just naming it." I closed the door while they were still standing there. My hands shook for a moment afterward, not with fear, but with the delayed response of a body that had spent years bracing itself. I sat down and breathed until the shaking passed. Later that night, I checked my account. For the first time in years, the balance reflected only my life: rent, utilities, food, medication. Nothing extra siphoned away to maintain an illusion I wasn't invited to share. I slept deeply. The next morning, I woke up to an unfamiliar sensation: financial quiet. No anticipation of requests. No calculating how much generosity I could afford without putting myself at risk. Just numbers that belonged to me again. There were consequences, of course. I knew that. There always are when access is mistaken for entitlement. But consequences are not the same as regret. I brewed my coffee, sat by the window, and watched the street come alive. Somewhere across town, people were scrambling, rearranging, explaining themselves. Here, everything was still. Freezing the transfers did not make me cruel. It made me visible to myself again. And that visibility, once restored, was something I would never surrender back. The pressure arrived in waves after that, predictable and relentless. When money stops flowing quietly, people begin to speak loudly. Elaine stopped calling me directly. Instead, others began to appear. Voices I hadn't heard in years, all suddenly concerned. My sister left a message asking why I was causing unnecessary conflict at my age. A cousin I barely remembered suggested I was being prideful. Even a former neighbor called to say Elaine was under terrible stress and that I should be more understanding. None of them asked what had happened, only why I was refusing to smooth it over. That told me everything. Martin sent a long email 2 days later. I printed it, not because I needed it, but because I wanted to see the manipulation laid out clearly. He wrote about family loyalty, about sacrifices they had made, about how my actions were damaging their children. He mentioned my age twice, my health once, and the word responsibility no fewer than 7 times. He did not mention the parties. He did not mention the transfers. He did not mention consent. I placed the letter in the folder. Elaine tried a different tactic the following afternoon. She called crying. Real tears this time, I think. Not strategic, just panicked. We're drowning, she said. Everything is collapsing. I listened without interrupting. That was something I had learned long ago. If you let people speak long enough, they eventually tell you the truth they were trying to hide. We never meant for it to get this bad, she continued. It just happened. No, I said gently. It was arranged. She sobbed harder. What do you want from me? That was an honest question, finally. I want you to live within what you earn, I said. The same way I always did. She was quiet then. When she spoke again, her voice was flat. So that's it? You're done being our safety net? I was never meant to be one, I replied. I was meant to be your mother. She hung up. That evening, the inspector contacted me again. He informed me that formal notices had been sent and responses requested. There were discrepancies in the explanations already received. You may experience increased contact, he warned. Please continue documenting. I am, I said. Every word. The next day, Martin came back alone. He looked smaller somehow, not physically, but structurally, like something essential had been removed, and he hadn't figured out how to stand without it. I need you to reconsider, he said quietly, just until we get back on our feet. I shook my head. Your feet were never on the ground. They were on my back. He stared at me, stunned. I don't think anyone had ever spoken to him that plainly before. You're ruining our relationship, he said. No, I replied. I'm ending an arrangement. He left without another word. That night, I sat at my desk and wrote down every attempt at contact, every message, every visit. Dates, times, summaries. I did not editorialize. I did not justify. I documented. As I closed the notebook, I felt something shift again. Not fear, not sadness, but a deep, steady resolve. They were no longer trying to understand. They were trying to wear me down. But I had lived through scarcity, grief, and years of quiet erasure. This was simply noise. I went to bed early, leaving my phone in the other room. For the first time since the transfers froze, I slept without interruption. In the morning, I woke knowing something clearly. Pressure only works on people who still believe they owe access to their lives. I no longer did. By the time I decided to go further, the decision felt less like escalation and more like completion. I had already frozen the transfers. I had already spoken to the inspector. But there was still a part of the system that needed clarity, the part that assumed I was passive by default, the part that relied on my age, my quietness, my reluctance to make trouble. That part needed a formal answer. I called the Pension Oversight Office on a Monday morning and requested an in-person consultation, not to complain, to document. The woman on the phone asked if someone would be coming with me. "No," I said. "I'll come alone." The appointment took place 2 days later. The building was newer than the inspector's office, all glass and soft chairs meant to signal comfort. I found the atmosphere misleading. Comfort is irrelevant when truth is involved. The advisor assigned to me was younger than my daughter. She spoke gently, carefully, as if worried I might confuse processes with intentions. I corrected that assumption immediately. "I'm here to report prolonged third-party misuse of my pension funds," I said. "I'd like to review how that authority was granted and how it was exceeded." Her posture changed, shoulders back, pen ready. We went through the authorization forms together. The original wording was narrow: temporary assistance, basic living support, discretionary oversight retained by me. Somewhere along the years, that language had been stretched until it no longer resembled its purpose. "This level of expenditure would normally trigger a review," she said quietly, scanning the statements. "It didn't," I replied, "because no one expects an elderly woman to notice." She didn't argue. By the end of the meeting, a formal notation had been added to my pension file. A flag, they called it. I preferred the word record, something that stays. As I left the building, my phone buzzed. Elaine again. "Why are you involving more people? Isn't this enough?" I didn't answer. Enough is a word used by people who have already taken too much. That afternoon, I met with an independent financial advisor. Not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted insulation. Clear boundaries. No informal access. No assumptions masked as love. We restructured everything. Single point control. No third-party permissions. Monthly reviews sent directly to me. It felt almost indulgent, the level of clarity, like clean air after years of smoke. The advisor looked at me at the end and said, "You should have done this sooner." "Yes," I answered, "but I'm doing it now." That evening, the calls intensified. Elaine left a message accusing me of trying to ruin her. Martin sent another email, this time threatening consequences. Vague ones, poorly thought through. I forwarded both to the inspector's office and added them to my records. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger had burned out, replaced by something sturdier. Conviction, perhaps, or simply self-respect, long delayed. I sat by the window as night fell, watching the lights come on one by one. People settling into lives supported by structures they rarely question. For years, my life had supported others invisibly, quietly, reliably. Now, it supported me. I did not feel victorious. I felt aligned, as if a crooked picture had finally been straightened after decades of being slightly off. Calling the financial inspector again was not an act of revenge. It was an act of completion, of making sure the truth existed somewhere outside my own memory. At my age, you stop worrying about being liked. You start worrying about being accurate. And accuracy, I had learned, is a form of dignity no one can take from you once you decide to claim it. The consequences arrived quietly at first, almost politely, as if unsure whether they were allowed to exist. Elaine stopped calling altogether. That silence was heavier than the shouting had been. Silence means recalculation. It means someone is no longer trying to persuade you and has begun to adjust their story instead. Martin, on the other hand, unraveled in plain view. He sent messages late at night, then deleted them. He called once and hung up before I answered. When he finally did speak to me, his voice had lost its edge and gained something brittle. "They're asking questions," he said. "Real ones." "That's what questions are for," I replied. He swallowed audibly. "They want explanations for expenses." "You should give them," I said. "They don't like the explanations," he muttered. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to add that wouldn't sound like instruction, and I had already instructed enough people in my life. A week later, I received formal notice that the review had expanded. Not dramatically, not punitively. Expanded. That word again. Neutral. Procedural. Impossible to argue with. Requests had been sent. Deadlines set. Documentation required. Elaine finally came after that. She looked older than she had a month earlier. Not aged, unsettled. As if the ground beneath her had shifted and she hadn't yet learned how to stand without leaning on me. "They think we planned it," she said. No greeting, no accusation, just disbelief. "You did," I answered calmly. She stared at the floor. "We didn't think it mattered." That sentence stayed with me long after she left. They didn't think it mattered. My comfort, my limits, my future. None of it had mattered enough to ask. The inspector called me later that day to clarify a timeline. His questions were precise, professional. At one point he said, "Your records have been very helpful." I thanked him. I didn't mention the years it took to learn how to keep them without apologizing. By the second week, the tone of communication from my family changed again. Less pressure, more caution. They had begun speaking to lawyers, to advisors, to each other. Their certainty had dissolved into logistics. They no longer asked me to fix it. They asked what I wanted. "I want nothing," I told Elaine when she finally asked directly. "Except distance." She nodded, as if she had expected that answer, but hoped it would be different. At home, life settled into something unfamiliar and steady. My pension arrived untouched. My bills were paid. I bought better food. Not extravagant, just better. I replaced a chair that hurt my back. I paid for a checkup I had postponed for years. None of it felt indulgent. It felt corrective. One afternoon, I found myself laughing out loud at something on the radio. The sound startled me. It had been a long time since my body had produced joy without permission. I knew there would be lasting damage. Relationships do not survive exposure easily. But what surprised me was how little grief I felt. Grief is for loss. This felt like recovery. I watched my life shrink and expand at the same time. Fewer people, clearer space, less noise, more presence. I wasn't lonely. I was unburdened. When the inspector eventually informed me that findings would be finalized soon, I felt no anticipation. Whatever the outcome, the truth already existed. That was enough. That night, I sat by the window again, as I had so many times before, but this time, the view felt different. Not because the street had changed, but because I was no longer watching from the margins of my own life. They had used my pension for their comfort and called it family. I had taken it back and called it reality. And reality, once accepted, has a way of sorting things out on its own. The weeks after that were quiet, in a way I had almost forgotten was possible. Not empty, not lonely, just quiet. like a room after furniture has been moved out and the air finally circulates. I began to notice small things again. How sunlight reached the kitchen table around 9 in the morning. How my hands no longer shook when I opened my banking app. How I stopped flinching every time the phone buzzed. Silence, I learned, is only frightening when it follows neglect. When it follows clarity, it is restorative. I reorganized my apartment slowly, without urgency. I threw out stacks of old papers I no longer needed. I labeled drawers properly. I put everything back where it belonged, including myself. The order was not obsessive. It was respectful. This is my space, I told myself. It does not need to justify its existence. I changed my routines. I stopped buying the cheapest version of everything, not because I wanted luxury, but because I wanted care. Better bread, fresh vegetables instead of canned, a proper coat instead of the one I'd been patching for years while paying for other people's dinners. These were not rewards. They were corrections. The doctor noticed the change before I did. My blood pressure was lower, my sleep more regular. "Whatever you're doing," she said, "keep doing it." I smiled and didn't explain. Some improvements are not medical in origin. Elaine didn't visit, not once. At first, that hurt in a distant theoretical way, like an old bruise you forget until you press it. Then even that faded. I realized something uncomfortable but freeing. Our relationship had been sustained by transactions, not presence. Remove the transactions, and there was nothing left to negotiate. I thought I would grieve that more. I didn't. Instead, I found myself remembering who I had been before I learned to disappear for convenience. I took long walks again, not to save on heating costs, but because I enjoyed movement. I sat on benches and watched people without comparing my life to theirs. Comparison had always been another form of self-erasure. One afternoon, I met a neighbor I barely knew. She asked how I was doing, and for once, the answer came easily. "I'm well," I said, and I meant it. The inspector's final call came on a Thursday. His voice was the same, professional, neutral, but there was finality in it. Findings recorded, recommendations issued, no further action required from me unless I chose otherwise. "Thank you for your cooperation," he said. "Thank you for your accuracy," I replied. After the call, I sat for a long time without moving. I wasn't waiting for relief or celebration. I was letting the moment settle. This was the end of something, but not in the dramatic sense people expect. It was the end of misunderstanding, of self-betrayal disguised as generosity. That evening, I cooked a proper meal for myself and set the table even though I was alone. Not to pretend I wasn't, but to honor the fact that I was worth the effort regardless. I thought about age then, how people speak of it as a narrowing, as loss, as retreat. But what I felt was the opposite. With fewer obligations imposed by guilt, my world had become smaller but truer. And truth, I've learned, takes up exactly the space it needs. I no longer wondered whether I had been too harsh. That question belongs to people who still believe self-protection requires permission. What I had done was simple. I had stopped funding my own erasure. At night, I slept deeply. No rehearsed conversations. No imagined justifications. Just rest. If there was victory in this story, it was not over anyone else. It was over the version of myself that had mistaken endurance for love. That version had served her time, and she was finally allowed to retire. The letter arrived on a Friday, thin and unremarkable. the kind that usually contains nothing you need to remember. I opened it slowly, not because I was afraid, but because I no longer rushed moments that belonged to me. The findings were final. The language was careful, neutral, clear. No wrongdoing attributed to me. Unauthorized use confirmed. Corrective measures documented. Case closed. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer with my will and my medical papers. Not as a trophy, as a boundary, preserved in ink. That afternoon, Elaine called for the first time in weeks. Her voice was different, cautious, stripped of certainty. "They said it's over," she said. "Yes," I replied. A pause followed. Then, quietly, "I didn't think it would end like this." I looked out the window at the street below. Children playing, someone walking a dog, life continuing without commentary. "It didn't end," I said. "It clarified." She didn't argue. That, more than anything else, told me how much had changed. We spoke briefly, about nothing important. Weather, logistics. The conversation felt like two people acknowledging a shared past without trying to rebuild it in the same shape. When the call ended, I felt no need to call back. I made tea and sat in my chair, the one that no longer hurt my back. My pension had come in that morning, whole and undisturbed. I paid my bills, transferred a small amount to savings, and closed the app without anxiety. That simple act felt like a private ceremony. At 72, you stop fantasizing about justice as spectacle. You stop needing apologies to be loud or public. What you want is alignment, your life making sense again from the inside out. I thought about all the women I've known who disappeared quietly into usefulness. Mothers, grandmothers, aunts, women who mistook being needed for being valued, and who paid for it with their peace. No one taught us where the line was. We were praised for crossing it. If I could speak to my younger self, I wouldn't warn her to be harder. I would tell her to be clearer. Clarity is kinder than sacrifice when sacrifice is expected and never returned. In the evening, I took a walk. The air was cool, honest. I passed windows glowing with dinners I wasn't invited to and didn't want to attend. I felt no bitterness, just space. When I returned home, I sat down and wrote one last note in my notebook. Not a record, not evidence. A reminder. Money is not love. Silence is not peace. Endurance is not virtue. I closed the notebook and put it away. If you're reading this and something in it feels familiar, the quiet pressure, the small justifications, the way your needs shrink to make room for others, listen to that feeling. It isn't selfish, it's accurate. You don't need permission to protect what keeps you alive. You don't need to disappear to be loved, and it is never too late to say, "This is mine." If this story resonated with you, don't keep it to yourself. Leave a comment. Share it with another woman who may need the reminder. Sometimes all it takes to change a life is realizing you're not the only one who finally said no.